Okay. I have to wait till he goes like that. Good morning, everyone. We really have a packed house, and we have people sitting in the atrium, so it should be a really good chat. Welcome to Skidompha Library and Chats with Champions. Chats has a 15-year history of presenting programs that span the interest of all segments of our community. It is sponsored by Sherman's Main Coast Bookshop and Cafe. Today, we are proud to present award-winning and New York Times best-selling author Doug Preston. Since the days of Conquistador Hernan Cortez, rumors have circulated about the ancient white city of immense wealth hidden in the Honduran interior. Indigenous tribes spoke of ancestors who had fled there to escape the Spanish, warning that anyone who disturbs this sacred city would fall ill and die. Myths of treasure and every imaginable curse ran rampant. But the fact is that the city existed somewhere out in the jungles of Mosquita, was widely accepted by the Hondurans. In 1940, I can't say that. You know what I mean. He's a journalist, Theodore Morty, returned from the jungle with hundreds of artifacts and tantalizing stories of having seen the crumbling walls of the lost city of the monkey god for himself. Soon after, he committed suicide without revealing its mysterious location. 3/4 of a century later, Doug Preston climbed aboard a rickety single-engine plane carrying a machine that would change everything: LiDAR, light detection and ranging, an expensive laser technology on loan from NASA that could map the terrain under the dense rainforest canopy to a resolution within 3 feet. That flight revealed for the first time an unmistakable image of a sprawling metropolis, tantalizing proof of not just the mythical city, but of an entire lost civilization, contemporaries of, but distinct from the Mayans. His first-hand account of a discovery of this previously unknown civilization is not only riveting in and of itself, but also profound in its implications for the past, present, and future of Central America. Doug Preston grew up in Wellesley, Mass., and attended Pomona College in Claremont, California, where he studied mathematics, biology, physics, anthropology, chemistry, geology, and astronomy. We all have children like that. Before settling down to English literature. After graduating, Preston began his career at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where he worked as a writer, editor, and eventually manager of publications. He also taught nonfiction at Princeton University and served as managing editor and curator of a journal for museum professionals. He has written for The New Yorker, Natural History, National Geographic, Harper's, Smithsonian, and The Atlantic. The author of several acclaimed books, including the best-selling Monster of Florence, and several acclaimed nonfiction books. He also is a co-author with Lincoln Child of the best-selling series of novels featuring FBI agent Pendergast. Preston has published a number of solo novels, including Tyrannosaurus Canyon, Blasphemy, and Impact. Doug and his wife Christine divide their time between New Mexico and Maine. It's my pleasure to introduce Doug Preston.
Well, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Maybe it's too loud even. Thanks to Skidompha for organizing this wonderful series of lectures, and also to Sherman's Main Coast Bookstore. It's wonderful to have a truly independent bookstore in Damariscotta. It's just great. to see that bookstore thriving. So it's incredible to think that in the 21st century, a lost city could still be found somewhere on the surface of the earth. But that's exactly what happened, and this is the true story of it. And it's quite an incredible story. If I tried to write this as a novel, I'm sure my editors would have said, no, could never happen, forget it. But it really did happen, and it is all true. The region in question is called La Mosquitia, and it's an area of 32,000 square miles encompassing both Nicaragua and eastern Honduras. And it's one of the most remote places in the world. It's an area of just thousands of square miles of swamps, and then extremely mountainous terrain covered by some of the thickest jungle in the world, and in certain areas are completely unpopulated. Here is a Google image of it. You can see these areas are swamps, and the mountains are right here. And the area that we're dealing with, where the lost city was found, is right in the center of that green area there, called La Mosquitia, which, by the way, the name does not come from the mosquito, although there are plenty of mosquitoes in La Mosquitia. The name comes from the fact that the British and the Spanish were fighting over eastern Honduras for a long time, and the British gave a group of Indians muskets, which is the word in Spanish is mosquete. So the Indians became known as the Mosquetes Indians, or the Mosquito Indians, and the area became known as La Mosquitia. So it has long been known as an extremely formidable area. Here is a 19th century map where it's labeled the Portal del Infierno, which in Spanish means the gates of hell. And it was never colonized by the Spanish. The Spanish actually never even penetrated the interior. They did settle the coast, but they never, and they also settled the valleys south, but they never penetrated the central part of La Mosquitia. And in fact, even today, there are valleys in those mountains that remain scientifically unexplored. It's one of the last scientifically unexplored places on the surface of the earth. The interest in the area really blossomed in the early 19th century when a fellow named John Lloyd Stevens, who was a New Yorker, heard rumors of great cities in Central America, and he wangled a diplomatic appointment to the Federation of Central America, which was a very short-lived country which encompassed all of Central America outside of Mexico. But that was just a cover for exploration. And he'd heard rumors about a city, a great city in the forest, in the jungle. And so he set out with Indian guides, and after a brutal journey, he came across this stela, which is of a ruler of Copan, and he discovered the city of Copan. It had been known beforehand, but he was the first one to bring it to the attention of the West. And he had with him a British artist named Frederick Catherwood, who carried on horseback a camera obscura, and he was able to project images of these findings that they made, and then he would copy them in meticulous detail. These are extremely important images, but this was the first thing they saw. And he wrote a book about it called Incidents of Travel in Central America and the Yucatan in Chiapas, and it became the biggest best-selling book in the 19th century, nonfiction book. And it was incredible. Americans were absolutely astounded and thrilled that the New World had ruins, had great civilizations that rivaled anything that the Old World had produced. Because up to that time, Americans really had a view of Native Americans, of Indians as being, quote-unquote savages and so forth, very racist and limited view. And all of a sudden, this book showed that, in fact, the New World had produced civilizations that were equal to anything, equal to Egypt, equal to the glories of ancient Rome. So Catherwood and Stevens, well, Stevens was an entrepreneur, he's an American, so he promptly bought Copan and made plans to load it stone by stone on barges and have it transported to New York where it could be rebuilt as a tourist attraction. Fortunately, and he paid $50 for Copan from the landowner, the farmer who owned it. But fortunately, he never was able to put his plan in action. But it did create the idea in the American imagination that Central America held many cities and many mysteries to be revealed. And the cities of the Maya were, Stevens went on to explore quite a few cities of the Maya, and in this book, I think he wrote about 20 or 30 of them that he found. But he never went east of Copan because the jungle became too thick and it was too dangerous, the mountains were too high, and that area remained unexplored. And anthropologists and archaeologists really wondered how far eastward did the Maya realm extend? Did it extend into these impenetrable jungles? And finally, in the 20th century, a fellow named William Duncan Strong from the Bureau of American Ethnology led an expedition into the Mosquitia region, and this is his notebook, which I looked at in the Smithsonian Institution, still preserved. And he was a wonderful artist as well as an explorer. And here is a map that he drew of where he went. But while he was exploring, he heard stories about a Ciudad Blanca, a white city, which others called the lost city of the monkey god, somewhere deep in the mountains, a city of crumbling white ramparts and so on and so forth. And he wrote about it in his journals, and I read about his descriptions of this city, and it was apparently a fairly widespread legend in Honduras at the time, and researchers later were able to trace it all the way back to the time of Cortez, when Cortez was, after he conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, he went southward, and he was anchored off the coast of Honduras, which he named it Honduras. In Spanish, Honduras means very deep, the depths, because when he was dropping anchor of his ship, he couldn't find bottom. It was very difficult, so he called it the depths. But he wrote a very famous letter to the Emperor Charles V, in which he said that he had heard very reliable stories about provinces and cities of immense wealth in the interior of eastern Honduras. I was never able to explore it, but that probably got this rumors going of a lost city or something, a province of great wealth in that area. Well, a number of expeditions were launched in the 30s to explore and search for this lost city of the monkey god or the white city, and it wasn't unreasonable to think that the Maya realm did extend eastward, and there probably were great cities. So the Museum of the American Indian, which is now part of the Smithsonian, but at the time was in New York and an independent museum, sent 4 expeditions into Honduras looking for this lost city. And the final expedition was led by this gentleman, Theodore Mord, who the first 3 failed, although they heard all kinds of rumors and all kinds of stories that they were just excited everyone's imagination about this tremendous lost city. Well, this fellow launched an expedition under the auspices of the Museum of the American Indian in 1940. In January of 1940, he went into the interior of Honduras, and he came back out in May, and he had an incredible announcement to make. City of Monkey God is believed located. This was the headline in the New York Times. He claimed to have found the lost city of the monkey god. And he brought back a number of artifacts and so on and so forth. Caused a tremendous sensation in New York. But unfortunately, World War II broke out, so he was never able to return to excavate the city as he promised. And then after the war, he committed suicide, and he never revealed the location of the city to anyone, not even to his patrons at the museum, claiming he was worried about the problem of looting. Well, when I was writing my book, through an incredible series of coincidences, I got my hands on Theodore Mord's actual journals, which had been held by his family and kept secret. The family did not want anyone to read these journals. But the man who kept these journals was Theodore Mord's nephew, and he went to prison. And his wife didn't realize that he had been keeping these journals secret, and she shared them with the National Geographic and with me. And I read them, and I discovered the most incredible thing was that Theodore Mord did not find any lost city of the monkey god. It was a complete lie. It was an absolute fabrication. In fact, he didn't even go to Honduras looking for any lost city. He had a secret agenda. And this is the page of the journal which really is the damning page. He wrote this on the very last day of their expedition. He said, "There are no archaeological ruins up here of any significance whatsoever. Obviously, there's nothing up here." So what was he doing? Well, most of the journal is filled with descriptions of his desperate and feverish hunt for gold. He and his partner thought they were going to strike gold like, another Yukon or another California. And they did strike gold, and they spent weeks in the backbreaking work of excavating and placer gold. But he never went anywhere near. He said he went, the city of the monkey god was a complete fabrication, and all the artifacts he brought out, he bought on the coast after the expedition was over, or dug up. He talked to people. They said, "Oh yeah, there's some more artifacts over here." So he'd dig a few up and so forth. So that was quite a shock. Now, this brings me up to but that wasn't known until I published my book. Up to that point, everyone believed he probably had found a major archaeological site. He did have all these artifacts. You can go to the Smithsonian, they're still in their collections. So this excited everyone's imagination. There have been a whole series of expeditions in the 1950s, the 60s, 70s, and the 80s looking for this lost city. Until 1994, when a guy named Steve Elkins, who was a filmmaker in California, heard about this rumor, and I don't know, he got it in his head somehow that he was going to find the lost city of the monkey god, and he was going to film it. He was going to show the discovery in real time on film. And that was in 1994. So I'm going to show you here. This is a video that the New Yorker magazine made of footage from the discovery eventually of the lost city of the monkey god. It's not really the lost city of the monkey god. It's improper for me to say that. It is a lost city in the region where the lost city was believed to be located. And it appears that, in fact, the legend of the lost city of the monkey god or the white city was really an amalgam of many lost cities in this area that sort of coalesced into one legend of a single lost city. But this has some really interesting footage.
Oh, and Miles is going to give us the wheel right through the gap. Look at that. There it is. The lost civilization.
We're going to use this point, we've already marked it as our base location.
He was the expedition
You can
leader.
roam 10, 15 meters from here, probe out, but I don't want you to go any more than that. If at any point you think, oh bugger, where are they? Get on the whistle.
That was the chief archaeologist in the white hat, Chris Fisher.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Just walk back.
We're probably going to go over this and then into the next one, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's not mess around. Let's just go. I know where we are. So let's go up. Let's go up on top of this one and work our way back down that way.
There's a heap.
There are inscriptions right here.
There are?
Yes. On the edge here,
my
these
God.
decorations anyway.
Wow,
that's it.
wow, wow, wow. Look at the ones
This is
that
it.
I
It's a
Oh, my
metate.
goodness,
It's a
look
place
at
where they have
that.
a bunch of metates at school.
Wow,
I saw lots of those.
Okay, whoa, whoa, whoa. Everybody stop. Back up. Don't touch anything. Don't clear anything, please.
Looks like the ears are more of a jaguar. That's what I think it is.
So those ears are 3 months away.
Oh, you think so?
We're celebrating tonight. Now we're talking.
Okay, so those are highlights from the discovery. One of the great disappointments that you're going to have, and that I had as well, was when we found the lost city, we couldn't see anything. The jungle was so thick, you literally couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. And I remember when the archaeologist was saying, there's a pyramid right there. And I'd say, where? He said, 10 feet, there's a pyramid. We looked and we couldn't see it. And he said, don't you see how the ground suddenly goes up? And I said, yeah, I can see that. But so it was very hard to get a sense of the city. But so now I'm going to tell you about how it was discovered, what happened. So Steve Elkins in 1994 had this idea, and he organized an expedition into Honduras, into Mosquitia, and they spent 3 weeks tramping around the jungle, bitten by insects, just rained on. It was absolutely miserable, and they found nothing. And he said, he decided that, wandering around the jungle at random is no way to find anything. So he went to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. He lives in Pasadena, California. And he found a guy there named Ron Blum, who was the world's expert on remote sensing of the Earth from space. This is a branch of NASA where they look at the Earth from space and do very sophisticated analyses of it in many different levels, from meteorological to topographical and so forth. And he said to Ron, I want you to look in eastern Honduras, and I want you to see if there's a lost city in the jungle. And so Blum, and he hired him as moonlighting, essentially. I mean, he's paying this guy off, I mean, he's not, this is not an official NASA project. But Blum was really intrigued. And so Steve had done all this research on where the city might be located, where some people reported it and so forth. And so Ron Blum looked at satellite imagery, synthetic radar imagery from the space shuttle, all kinds of data, Japanese radar, satellite infrared imagery of the Earth and so forth. He combined it all, and he looked to see what might be visible under the jungle canopy, what could be seen. Now, this was back in the 90s when this was a very difficult project, but in an unnamed valley, which he called Target 1, he told Steve that he had found unnatural rectilinear and curvilinear objects, shapes, some of them as big as a mile, on the size of a mile, that he felt might represent the remains of a lost city. So in 1998, Steve organized an expedition, but unfortunately it had to be canceled because of Hurricane Mitch, which was a terrible hurricane that destroyed Honduras. It killed 7,000 people and destroyed 70% of the roads in the country. And so Steve gave up. And then in 2012, he heard about this new technology called LIDAR, light detection and ranging. And it is an incredibly powerful technology, and I'll describe it in a minute how it works, but it really allows you to see through the thickest jungle canopy and map the ground. A very advanced technology developed by NASA for use in mapping the moon and in mapping Mars, and it eventually became used for mapping the Earth. And then the technology improved. It's actually, some of this technology is classified military technology of the same kind used to guide cruise missiles, so that it's very difficult for the technology to leave the borders of the United States. But anyway, so in 2012, Steve managed to persuade the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping at the University of Houston to look for a lost city, to look at T1. Let's see what's in T1. Let's see if in 20 years later there might be something in this completely unexplored valley, which Steve had determined was unexplored. There was no record of any human beings ever going in there. And so eventually, at a cost of $1 million, they brought down this little plane from the University of Houston. Inside that plane, the guts are ripped out, and there is a machine called a LIDAR machine. And the export permit, the State Department issued an export permit for 2 weeks, required the plane to be guarded by armed soldiers whenever it was on the ground. And so these are Honduran soldiers hired by Steve. You know, I don't know what that is. This is on Roatan Island in Honduras, and I really don't know what that is. This is the little airport there. This was a security section of the airport that was off to one side, guarded by soldiers. No one could go there. So these guys, they love to pose with their guns. And so the plane was launched, and the valley of T1 is 20 square miles. But just in case there wasn't anything in T1, Steve arranged for the plane to survey 2 other possible areas where there might be a lost city, T2, Target 2, and Target 3. And these were all, extremely isolated valleys, never been scientifically explored in the dense jungle. I mean, T1 was remarkable. It's when you see it, it looks just like The Lost World of Arthur Conan Doyle. This beautiful 20 square mile valley with rivers flowing through it and some open areas and massive trees, completely surrounded by impenetrable mountains with only one point of access where the rivers flow out of the valley. There's like a notch in it. And it's the only way to get in and out of that valley, except by helicopter. So I rode in this plane when it flew over T1 on the 3rd day of mapping, the 3rd and final day of mapping. There's no seat. I was jammed in the back. It was 6 hours of flying over the jungle. The air conditioning in the plane was broken, so it was like 110 degrees. The pilot and the LiDAR engineer were very nervous about me there. They said, there's no bathroom on the plane. I said, well, what happens if you have to go to the bathroom? And they said, well, you go in your pants. I said, oh. And they said, we're going to be flying back and forth. There's incredible turbulence over the jungle. We're going to be making these turns for 6 hours back and forth. Don't eat anything. Don't even have a cup of coffee because you will be throwing up if you do. So here's a picture I took, and it shows you. So this is Juan Carlos Fernandez, who is the chief LiDAR engineer, who by complete coincidence happened to be Honduran. And his laptop, which is sitting on top of the LiDAR box, that laptop had the flight pattern on it, which is hooked into the navigational system of the plane. And there's the pilot, Chuck Gross, in the front, who is flying the plane based on that navigational pattern. It's kind of a lawnmower pattern. So they spent 3 days surveying T1. This massive amount of data, gigabytes of data were uploaded to Houston, the University of Houston, where they were crunched on large computers and then downloaded. And on May 5th, 2012, the images had been processed and were ready to be looked at. And here we are looking at the images. It was this guy, this bald guy in the front, is Michael Sartori, who was the chief mapping engineer, and he was so skeptical of the project. He thought it was the dumbest thing that he'd ever been involved in. He was shaking his head. He said, this is crazy. They're just looking for a lost city. Are you kidding me? They're spending $1 million, this money thrown away. This is not a legitimate scientific project. We should not be doing this. He was not. But that morning of May 5th, we heard a shout about 7:30 in the morning. He comes running out of his bungalow in his flip-flops, screaming and waving his arms. There's something in the valley. There's something in the valley. We were like, my God, what is wrong? What has happened here? So we rushed in and we looked. And you didn't have to be an archaeologist to see pyramids, to see plazas, to see terracing. I mean, an immense city under the jungle canopy in T1. Now, because Steve had already paid for surveying T2 and T3, the plane went on and surveyed T2 and T3. And when the images of T3 came back, there was another city, 3 times the size of T1. That city has not been explored yet. Now this shows you how powerful LiDAR is. This is one of the central plazas in T1. It's the laser. So the way LiDAR works is it's a laser beam, infrared laser beam. 125,000 pulses of laser are beamed into the canopy by the plane every second. There's so many pulses of laser that they find every single hole in the canopy. Now, if you, even in the densest jungle, if you lie on your back and look up, you will see tiny specks of blue sky. And this LiDAR finds every single one of those specks, and one of those beams will a few of those beams hit the ground and come back. And so it creates what's known as a point cloud. So 99% of the reflections are from leaves, but a few are from the ground. So this is the point cloud showing the leaves and the ground. And it's a three-dimensional portrait of the jungle. And here is what you can do with computers. You can rotate it in every direction, and then you can remove the trees. And you can see that there's this, a plaza there. It's a little rough looking. And it's really incredible. Here's another LiDAR image. This is the valley of T1 with the trees in place. Now I'm going to remove the trees. And you can see all these archaeological sites. Actually, there are many more than what are highlighted here. Let's see. Well, the central complex is over there. Actually, the pyramid is not even highlighted. I don't know who did this highlighting, but here is the archaeologist then took those images and mapped the city. So it runs up and down this river valley, about 1.5 miles up and down the river valley, extensive irrigation systems, terracing, plazas. Actually, it even goes farther than that up, and there were many, many sites in the jungle around. Really quite extraordinary. And those two images are scale images of the two largest sites found in Honduras so far, outside of Copan. And you can see how much bigger this site is than either of those. And here is the center of the site, where it says cache. I'm going to talk about that later. The pyramid is on the right. It's an earthen pyramid. It's somewhat eroded. There may be a stone pyramid underneath, covered by vegetation. They haven't figured that out yet. There's a central plaza. There's terracing, more plazas, and all kinds of features. So this was discovered in 2012. So in 2015, Steve organized a ground expedition in cooperation with National Geographic and the Honduran government. And I was covering the story for National Geographic at this point. That's myself. That's Dave Yoder, who is a Nat Geo photographer. And this is a Honduran military Air Force helicopter that was used in the expedition. And as I was about to take off into the jungle on this expedition, we'd be cut off from all communication. Steve Elkin said, "Wait a minute, Doug, don't you want to say goodbye to your wife? Because she may never see you again." I said, "Well, how am I going to do that?" He said, I'll record you on my cell phone, and then when I get back to the city we were staying in, Catacamas, I'll email it to her. So he later sent me this.
Okay, go ahead.
"Hey, Christine, I'm going off into the jungle. I love you. I'll see you in a couple of weeks." So here is the valley itself. You saw in that video, they were flying through this gap. This is the gap. This is a huge gorge. Actually, it's covered. These trees are 150 feet high, so they're really obscuring it. But it's the only route into the valley. And you can see there are these mountains all around. Some of these mountains are 1 mile high, and then this beautiful valley. And it's not hard to understand why a city was built here. This is a natural fortress of the most remarkable kind that just formed incredible natural protection for this city. And these mountains were just tremendously spiky mountains. And this just shows you how thick that jungle canopy is. So we had 3 British ex-SAS soldiers with us on the expedition who were head of logistics, and their job was to keep us all alive in the jungle. And here's the helicopters landing. 2 of them are running to the helicopter. I took this picture from the helicopter just after we landed. They actually dropped these guys in this little area alongside the stream where they cleared out a tiny landing zone, just big enough for that little helicopter. And this shows you how small that landing zone is. That's the helicopter that was brought down from Albuquerque, New Mexico. It took 4 days to fly it down. Very expensive. And we had a pilot and a co-pilot with that helicopter. And then we had the Honduran military helicopter, which was too big to land here. And it landed in a site about 4 miles downriver and was used, and then they used this helicopter to ferry supplies back and forth from that larger site. And this was the river, the unnamed river flowing through the valley. There's actually several rivers that all came together. All their headwaters were inside that ring of mountains. Absolutely beautiful, unspoiled river. The water was crystal clear. We had Honduran soldiers with us, and they drank the water without any purification. So, and here are some of the soldiers. Again, they just love to have their pictures taken with their guns. And this is actually in the gap. We hiked down the river to the gap, and it became kind of a really rushing torrent that went through this gap in the mountains. And I'll just show you some pictures of our camp to give you a sense of what it was like. It poured rain every day. It rained about an inch a day. It was absolutely, we were just sometimes up to our thighs in mud. Actually, at one point, we almost lost our anthropologist. We had 10 PhDs on the expedition, and our anthropologist was from the Smithsonian, Alicia Gonzalez. She was short. She was about 5 feet tall, 60 years old, but a very intrepid person. And we were going through this mud hole, and she stopped moving, and I could see bubbles coming up around her, and she was starting to go down. And very calmly, she said, "Excuse me, I'm going down. I can't move. I'm really going down." So the British guys rushed in and wrestled her out of the mud, and it turned out that we all had to wear snake gaiters or snake protection because of the many poisonous snakes in the jungle. So hers had filled up with mud, and it was literally like a pair of cement overshoes sucking her down. Here is our camp, our kitchen. It just, it was raining all the time. And this was a very important path that led to this. It is as awful as it looks. I mean, if you weren't careful, you were going to slip and fall in there. And it was pouring rain, and that thing didn't keep out the rain at all. In fact, we were just soaked all the time. So the first night in camp, I came in with the advanced group. So there were just 5 of us and these 3 soldiers. I was walking back to my tent, and my flashlight beam illuminated a gigantic snake coiled up next to Juan Carlos's hammock. It was huge, and I'd walked by it twice, actually. It was in striking position, and it was tracking me like this, its little beady eyes gleaming at me and the tongue flicking out. So I said in a very calm voice, although they claim I shouted, but I did not. I said, "Hey, you guys, there's a big snake here." So they came rushing over, and Woody, who is the head SAS guy, this British guy, very understated gentleman, he said, "Oh, blimey, that's a fer-de-lance, one of the biggest ones I've ever seen." And the fer-de-lance, by the way, we'd already learned is the deadliest snake in the New World. It kills more people than any other snake in the entire New World. They're very aggressive. They will actually attack you sometimes. And when they bite you, they become so agitated that they'll pursue you and bite you again. And even with antivenom, you probably have to have your limb amputated because there's a necrotic nature to the poison. So this was a freak. I was very nervous. So we backed up, and he said, "Keep your lights on him. I'm going to move him." It actually turned out to be a her, by the way, because the female fer-de-lances get bigger than the males. So I thought, how's he going to move this snake? It turned out he misjudged slightly. Anyway, so he cut himself a snake stick with his machete with a fork at the end, and he pinned the snake. And one fast movement pinned the snake while we were all holding our lights on it. And that snake just exploded, absolutely uncoiled, just striking everywhere, and it was bigger than he was. And venom was flying out of its fangs. I mean, the fangs, and it opened its mouth so wide. It was this beautiful snow-white mouth. And with fangs that were over an inch long, and this yellow venom is squirting out, and he's striking everywhere. So Woody, very calmly, managed to work the stick up behind his head and grabbed him behind his neck. And the snake was swiveling his neck around, and with his fangs, trying to get him in the fist, expelled venom all over the back of his hands. And so his skin started to bubble. So he wrestled the snake to the ground, which was not easy. He had to pin it with his knees. He really had to fight. The snake was so strong. And he cut its head off. And the headless snake continued to fight with him and then tried to crawl off. And the head continued to snap and spew venom until he took his knife and pinned it into the, stabbed it through the skull into the dirt. So he immediately stood up and he washed his hands. I mean, we were speechless. Nobody said a word. He washed his hands and he said, "Nothing like that to concentrate the mind, is there?" So there's Woody with his snake, at least most of it. And then he said, there's always more than one. And he'd been on expeditions where people had been bitten by fer-de-lances and almost died, and had horrible, So he said, I said, "I hope you're going to bury that head, because that looks really dangerous, this fang sticking up." He said, "No, I have a better use for it." And he tied it to a tree in the center of camp. And this wasn't some macho gesture. He said, I want everyone to see this. I want everyone coming in to see how dangerous this area is, that we are not kidding. You wear those snake gaiters at all times, even when you get up at night to pee, especially when you get up at night, because the fer-de-lance comes out at night. So anyway, they do. Well, that's the problem. You can't see you're moving through the jungle, and the soldiers are slashing this vegetation, so you're wading through vegetation that's up to your knees, so you can't see what's underneath it. And there's animals in the trees, and the little fer-de-lances go up in the tree, and they drop down on you and bite you. And there are also these ants that are in trees, and if the leaves are shaking just a little bit, they all drop down your neck and all down, and they bite you, and they inject a toxin, and you have to be evacuated and go to the hospital. I mean, you wouldn't believe the list of insects and crazy. And I remember one night the first night I got up to pee, and I shined my light, and the whole ground was moving, and I was like, what the heck? The entire ground was covered with cockroaches, all moving, skittering about. Millions of them. I mean, it was unbelievable. So anyway, we brought a lot of scientific equipment with us. And now I'm going to show you the city, okay? That is looking across the stream to the location of the central pyramid and the central plaza of the city. And on the second day, we went in to explore it. Actually, moving in the river, it was really the best way to go. But of course, it's not in the river. We had to cross the river with the help of the soldiers. We had to hack through extremely heavy vegetation. This is all lobster heliconia, which you see in California. It's a gorgeous plant with flowers. You can't see any in this shot, but it was beautiful. Flowers were amazing. Here's one of the mud holes. I don't think this is the one where we almost lost our anthropologist, but it's similar. And the machetes, by the way, all had these day-glow tape on them, because when you're cutting in the jungle with a machete, you can't see your partner. You could actually slash someone open without realizing that they're standing right there. This is our archaeologist, Chris Fisher, with his very sophisticated Trimble GPS, which told him where everything was. And on this machine, he had loaded the LiDAR maps. So he would take this thing and he'd look at it and he'd say, okay, right there is a pyramid. Or we go, well, where? And then, of course, we'd see it and we'd climb it. Or he'd say, right over here is this mound. And we walk over there and boom, there was a mound. So we were able to find our way around in the jungle. It was very thick. This is actually an open area where a giant tree fell and took down 20 other trees with it. You can just see how thick it is. The next slide will show you the central plaza of the lost city of the monkey god. All right? There. That's it. We are right in the center. This is the Times Square of the lost city. And in fact, this jungle is so thick that if you put it down in Times Square and stood in the middle of it, you wouldn't know that you were in New York City, or a city at all. Here's another shot of the plaza, a slightly more open area. This is Steve Elkins himself, and this is the pyramid, the central pyramid. Now you can see the ground slopes upward like that. He's climbing the side of the pyramid. these trees, some of these trees had trunks that were 20 feet in diameter. Not these particular trees, but there were bigger ones. You know, it was incredible thickness of jungle. But see, that's the pyramid, the side of the pyramid. I'm standing on the side of the pyramid. We, of course, immediately started to find things, stones, and we found this incredible row of altar stones, and then we found a staircase. I wish I could, the pictures just don't, I took 800 pictures of them, and it's all just leaves. But we did find at the base of the pyramid, and you saw that scene, that was an actual scene where the archaeologist is saying, wait, don't touch anything. At the base of the pyramid, we found a cache of objects, stone carved objects of thrones, stone thrones, jars made out of stone, heads of sculptures and so forth, just the tops of which were peeking out of the ground. And these are some pictures I took at the moment of discovery. These are stone thrones, ceremonial seats, a stone jar. And here is sort of the area as it's being cleared. And this was actually the first thing that we saw, and it was this jaguar head coming out of the ground attached to something. And we didn't know what it was attached to, but when it was excavated, this is what it was attached to. It was a sacred a seat of power, probably used by a shaman, who would put himself in touch with the power of the jaguar through the use of hallucinogenic drugs, probably. That image on the stone is not just is a weird jaguar. It's a shaman who's taken on the aspect of a jaguar to absorb its power. It's made out of basalt. It's very, very hard basalt or rhyolite. Yeah. And here are some of the jars that were found. These ceremonial jars covered with decorations that look like pseudoglyphs, but they're not glyphs. I mean, Mayanists have looked at this and said, we don't know what these are. It's obviously some kind of, it's more than just decoration. There's information being conveyed here. It's some kind of, perhaps some kind of writing. We just don't know what it is. And here is the excavation of that cache of objects. 52 of them were visible above the ground when we found them, and when they excavated just a 200 square foot area, they found 500 sculptures, all at the base of this pyramid, and that's all they've done so far. In January, the Hondurans are going to excavate further and see what else they might find. But out of this entire city that covers 1,000 acres, they've only excavated 200 square feet. So here are some of the pictures of the excavation. These excavations took place in 2016, and the objects were removed. And I've got some in my garage here in Maine. And no, I'm kidding. They went to the National Museum in Honduras in Tegucigalpa. They were on display at the Presidential Palace. A bunch of them were put on display at the American Embassy in Tegucigalpa, where the American ambassador was very pleased with this discovery. In fact, everyone in Honduras was pleased because Honduras has been all the news coming out of Honduras is about drug smuggling, murders, dysfunction in the judiciary, whatever. And here was finally some good news that Hondurans could share with the world. And the president was very interested in it. He visited the site personally. I'll show you some pictures of him. He actually removed the first objects, and the American ambassador was very, very pleased with the fact that the United States could participate with Honduras in something very positive for the country, instead of just telling Honduras, you got to stop the drug smuggling or whatever. The ambassador did that until he was removed by the Trump administration. There's no ambassador to Honduras now. Here are some of the objects removed. Here is these symbols may be related to what they call a Maya sky band. And Mayanists are studying this, trying to figure out what they mean, but they may refer to astronomical constellations in the sky of a sacred significance. And here is this very odd figure that has been argued over by the archaeologists. Some say this is a captive bound for sacrifice. Some say it is a mummy bundle, a body being transported to be buried, and others say it's a monkey, or a monkey god, actually. It's a half monkey, half human being, and you know that because it has an erection. This is what the archaeologist said to me. So I have no idea what it is. And then in the center of the cache, they found this very interesting sculpture of a vulture. And it turns out that vultures were very sacred to the Maya and to the indigenous people of the area today, and were a symbol, a very important symbol of death and rebirth. You know, the vulture eats the dead, and in fact, sacrificed victims were often fed to vultures. There are many depictions in Maya art of vultures feeding on sacrificed people, or feeding on enemies, the bodies of enemies on the battleground. But the vulture, you know, feeds on the dead, but then it flies way up in the sky and disappears. So it's like a connection between the earthly plane and the sacred plane above. And so the fact that this vulture was in the center of the cache, surrounded by all these objects, many of which had been ritually broken, was extremely revealing to archaeologists as to why this cache was there, what its significance was, and what it said about the fate of this city, which was absolutely tragic. I won't go into it now because it's kind of complicated, but it's all dealt with in my book. What happened to this city? Because this culture is a very interesting culture. They were adjacent to the Maya. They probably originated from the south, whereas the Maya came down from the north. And they were sort of in the meeting between the Maya and the southern cultures called the Chibcha people. And they coexisted for many centuries until the collapse of Copan. Copan collapsed around 850 AD during the general Maya collapse. And then this culture flowered. It had a tremendous flowering after the collapse of Copan, and it took on many aspects of Maya culture. They started to lay out their cities like the Maya. They started to play the Maya ball game, you know, the famous ball game where the losers sometimes, you know, lost their heads. And they took on aspects of Maya culture. So there's a big mystery here. What happened was, did a group of warriors come down from Copan and defeat these people? Or did refugees drift down from Copan and sort of bring with them new ideas? So there are a lot of theories, and I talk about some of these in my book. But then around 1500, this culture collapsed and vanished all over Mosquitia. Now, the Spanish never got into Mosquitia. There was no conquest. I mean, they never even met the Spanish. The Spanish didn't get within 100 miles of this city. So what happened? What caused the collapse? Well, something did, and a series of catastrophes swept this city, and the inhabitants finally decided to leave, the survivors, and they took all their ritual objects, placed them at the base of the pyramid, broke them to release their spirits into the spirit world, and walked out. And 500 years later, we came in. And why that happened, how that happened, is all covered in my book. So the president of Honduras was very excited. This is Steve Elkins, and on the left is Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's the president of Honduras at the present time. And I went down to Honduras, and we had a ceremony. There's the American ambassador to the left, the president, Steve Elkins, and myself, and we had a wonderful time at the American Embassy, and I taught some classes at the university there in Honduras, and it was really, really wonderful. And the Hondurans were very excited by this. They even made a stamp out of it. So most of the region of T1 still remains unexplored. This is the upper valley of T1. It's never been explored, just a helicopter overflight. Here's a ruin in the upper valley of T1. This is the LiDAR images. You can see there's a plaza here. That's a pyramid. There's probably another cache right here. This region is full of ruins. This was a very heavily settled area in prehistoric times, and now it's virtually depopulated. I'm just going to conclude my talk with this final picture. That is the National Institutes of Health. And I remember when we got out of the jungle, Steve Elkins, we were sitting around the pool, and Steve Elkins was mopping his brow, and he turned to me and he said, "Thank God that we got out of there and nobody was killed and nobody was hurt and nobody got sick." Well, his enthusiasm for escaping the jungle unharmed was premature. And in the ensuing months, it turned out that the valley of T1 was a hot zone of disease, an incurable and sometimes deadly disease called mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. And 60% of the expedition caught this disease, not just the Americans, the Brits, the Hondurans, the commander of the Honduran soldiers got it. It was terrible. And so the National Institutes of Health offered to treat all of us for free because they wanted to study this disease. It's very interesting to them. This is the leading institution in studying leishmaniasis in the world. So that's where I spent some time because I got the disease too. And don't worry, it's not contagious as long as you stay 15 feet away. No, it isn't contagious at all. It's not. It's like malaria. You can't get it except through the bite of a vector, which is, in the case of leishmaniasis, the sandfly, a certain species of sandfly, not found in Maine. So anyway, that's the end of my talk. Thank you all. And I know sometimes people have questions, so I'd love to answer questions. Yes?
I was wondering if you had a botanist with you. You said you had a number of PhDs.
We did. We actually had 3 PhD ethnobotanists, which is a slightly different thing than a botanist. The lead ethnobotanist was Mark Plotkin from Harvard University, and he was very interested in seeing what kind of plants might be there that were used by shamans for hallucinogenic purposes or for medicines or so forth that might remain from the time when the valley was inhabited. And then there was another, Luis Poveda, who was an ethnobotanist from the University of Costa Rica as well with him. But most recently, Conservation International sent a team of botanists and biologists into the valley. I think they're actually back in the valley right now getting rained on because it's the rainy season. But and we were there in the dry season and it rained an inch a day, so I'd hate to be there in the rainy season. It's the ecology of that valley is absolutely unique. One of the biologists who went in there was Honduran, whose specialty, he'd been studying the Mesquitia jungle all his life. And he was practically weeping. He said, "I never expected in my lifetime to see anything like this. Everything here is perfect. Everything is completely untouched. There are all these species that we thought had gone extinct in Honduras that are here. The valley was filled with cats, big cats, mountain lions and jaguars. And with animals. That had never seen people before. That would walk right up to you. It was. I've never seen anything like it. And to the biologists, it was stunning. So, yes.
What theory exists as to the climate when these cities were formed? I assume it wasn't full of jungle.
No, that's a really good question. The archaeologists believe, and this is true not just of this jungle, but even of the Amazon, was that when they previously thought there must be just hunter-gatherer people living in the jungle, now they realize that these areas were settled by extensive and sophisticated farming civilizations who cleared out huge areas of the jungle. They cut the trees down. They brought in the sunlight. They built, like in the Amazon, they built these artificial terraces of earth so that they could farm above the floodplains. And in the Mesquitia region, the archaeologist says it would have been, probably like a tended garden, but of a bit unkempt. There'd be stands of cacao trees. Chocolate was very important. There'd be fruit trees. There would be medicinal herbs. There would be lots of flower gardens because they used flowers in their religious ceremonies and so forth. So it would have been almost like a Garden of Eden. But there still would have been a lot of rain. But there's a dry season too, so that they had these irrigation systems, and there was actually an irrigation reservoir behind where we were camped, where if there was a severe dry season, they would impound water, and then they could irrigate their crops during that dry season. So, yes?
What were some of the other symptoms of the illness, and how did the NIH get involved?
Well, what happened was the National Geographic photographer is a bit of a hypochondriac, thank God. And he, you know, when you come out of the jungle, you're covered with bug bites, and it takes about a month or 6 weeks for them to go away. But on all of us, there were bug bites that weren't going away, and they were getting worse, and were starting to spread, and it was disgusting. You know, I won't even go into the details. You know, just it's a disease a bit like leprosy. So it eats away at you, and so I went to, you know, the doctor, you know, and they said, oh, it's an infection. I went again. And pretty soon, we were circulating photographs of our lesions, and the National Geographic photographer lived in Rome, and he Googled images on the web, and he said, oh my God, we've all got leishmaniasis. So he went to the main tropical hospital in Rome and was diagnosed. The doctor said, yes, I think you have leishmaniasis. You have to go back to the United States to get treatment, and you should go to the NIH because they're the ones. The treatment, unfortunately, for the disease is very rigorous. It's very unpleasant, and they use a drug that has side effects that are awful and even fatal sometimes. So, because they're trying to kill this parasite, but they don't want to kill you, so they're, you know, so yes. Well, it was actually, National Geographic funded very little of it. I think they threw in 100,000 or 200,000. The government of Honduras put in 800,000, and the investors who were making this documentary film, which by the way will be coming out probably next year, put in a couple of million. So it was a group of, yes.
Did you run into anybody living in the jungle today?
No, we didn't. We didn't see any sign of anyone living there or any indication that anyone had ever lived there. Although at the notch in those mountains, we saw some wild banana trees, which meant that people had been there at some point because bananas are native to Asia. They were brought to the New World by the Europeans. So if you see a banana tree, you know that there have been people there. So, but that was a long ways from the site. Yes?
Were the relics and the stone that you found quarried locally?
Yes. Well, they aren't really sure. They haven't been able to trace that. There were 5 different types of stone. It's a rhyolite or a basalt, and there were outcrops of this rhyolite and basalt in the river valley, but some of the types of rhyolite were not present in the river valley, so they think there might have been some kind of trade in this stone going on. Now, the site of T2, I mentioned T1 and T3. T2 had in it what looks like a stone quarry, a prehistoric stone quarry, but you know, no one's been to T2 either, so yes.
What did they use to carve the stone?
They didn't have metal, so archaeologists call these ground stone objects, so they ground them into shape with abrasives and sand and rocks and just grinding. Very, very time-consuming process. They couldn't chisel because they didn't have anything. And basalt is extremely hard rock. So very, very time-consuming. Yes?
2 quick questions. What first inspired you to do this? Did the investors contact you and say, hey, let's go?
Well, you know, it was kind of strange. Back in 1995, I was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory doing a story for National Geographic on Cambodia. And I was talking to Ron Blum. And, you know, I'm interviewing him. So I said, oh, are you working on any other projects? Oh, yeah, we're working on the mapping Civil War battlefields. We're working on the ancient caravan trails in the desert. We're doing this, we're doing that. And I said, well, you're looking for any lost cities? And he suddenly goes, oh, well, we are doing something like that. And, like, scientists are terrible at deception. So I immediately latched on that. I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? I can't talk about it. I signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. So I pressured him, and finally I said, look, have the guy call me. He said, he's not going to call you. I said, just tell him that I want to talk to him. So the guy called me, and that was Steve Elkins. And I did a little story for the New Yorker magazine in 1997 about this search without saying where it was, because they were worried about that. And then, so ever since then, I've been following Steve's saga about, oh God, the expedition was failed, and then he went and he tried to find the Loot of Lima treasure. He's like a guy who does all these crazy things, and each one sounded interested, so I remained friends with him, and finally in 2012 he called me up and he said, we're going down to Honduras, we got this plane, I raised $1 million, you got to come down and write about it for the New Yorker. So that's how I got into it.
Knowing what you know now, would you do it again?
Well, I would do it again. Even getting leishmaniasis, honestly, it was one of the greatest experiences of my life, and I wouldn't give it up. And I've done, a lot of dangerous things as a journalist, and if leash is the worst going to happen to me, then I guess I'm doing all right. So, yeah.
Is there a way of knowing what happened to these people by DNA or something?
Yes, absolutely, by DNA. That's a really good question. That research should be done, because there are indigenous people living in the region. There's several different people, the Yawaka, the Pesh Indians, and the, another tribe. Anyway, but they wonder who are the descendants of these people. If they did DNA studies, but unfortunately they've never found remains from this civilization, this ancient civilization that we found. They've never found human remains because the jungle soils are so acidic that they don't exist. So, unless they were buried in caves.
Died of disease, would they be able to figure that out?
Yes, if they found human remains, they would be able to figure out if they died of disease. Like, for example, leishmaniasis leaves a telltale mark on the bones. And also, if they're mummies, they'd be able to extract the parasites or whatever. So yeah, they can often tell what diseases affected people. So, yes?
Did they ever have any kind of imaging set up for the pyramids to see if there was anything?
No, and that's something that Steve Elkins has been trying to get them to do, is to figure out. I mean, these might be earthen pyramids, which are not uncommon at all, or they might be so buried in vegetation and trees over the centuries that the stone is 5 or 10 feet below the surface of the pyramid. So, Steve is trying to get them to do some kind of probing to see if there's a stone pyramid under there. So, yes.
Is there documentation of what the natural disasters would have been that made the people leave finally? You mentioned that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of indirect evidence what happened. It wasn't even a natural disaster. It was a very unnatural disaster, really terrifying. And I talk about it in my book. It's a really awful. Yeah, you got to buy the book to find out. So, all right. Thank you. Thank you. Sure.